floor. And yep, that's just the recording beginning. And just to invite Tricia up to the floor. I'm not going to be here at the end, just to let you know, Anne is going to be fielding the Q&A at the end. So I'm grateful to her for doing that. But I'd like to just pass over to Tricia now to set the scene for the rest of today's discussion.
Thank you, Tricia. Ross. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Although my daughter Claire's case, when she lost her in 2005, it's just as relevant today, because those same failings, that same lack of understanding and recognition of how dangerous stalking is there, and victims are being let down all the time. You probably won't be able to see, I'm not techie enough to share my screen, but perhaps you can see my daughter. She was 22 at the time, only just 22. She was she trained as a theatre makeup artist. She couldn't get work. She went into beauty consultancy and managed to get a job eventually in Harvey Nichols, not working for Harvey Nichols, but a skincare company headed by Kenneth Green, who is our patron of Protection Against Stalking. Claire, to describe Claire, she was beautiful inside and out, and that's not just mum talking, it's everybody that met Claire. She was gentle, she was shy, but she was like any other young woman. She loved to party, she had masses of friends, and really just before her death, she was really coming out of her shell. She had very little experience of boys, and they were boys at the time, and they never lasted, and she was disheartened, really. She felt that they didn't really want to get to know her for her. So going back, so she gets this job at Harvey Nichols, split shifts, various things going on, and she decided to move up to London, and she moved to Dulwich Village with two girls who were quite relevant to what happened to Claire. And they were both on the counter. Claire worked on the counter of La Prairie, which some of you will know is a very expensive product. And Claire would sometimes give facial massages and things like that. And she quite enjoyed her job. And she also enjoyed her new independence. The girls, Natalia was Eastern European, and she was like a big sister to Claire. And Susan worked part-time on the counter, and she was a dancer. These girls were very key to what happened with Claire. And so late 2004, she moved up to Dulwich Village. Early 2005, she met Michael Pesh, who was a Slovakian security guard for Harvey Nichols. And he'd also been a security guard for the American embassy in Bratislava. So on the back of that, he probably got the job at Harvey Nichols. We didn't know anything about him. I never met him. Claire said to me he was quite quiet, and he was a good-looking guy, and he said everything that Claire wanted to hear. They chatted at the counter, and he asked her out. Now, the relationship was really, really short. It only lasted 3 weeks, in fact. It was broken by the fact that he had a pre-planned holiday to visit his mother back in Bratislava. And he was away for 3 weeks as well. During that time, Claire liked him, and neither one of them had much money, so they would meet in the park or go for a walk or whatever. The girls didn't like him, and Claire was quite selective of what she told me, but I couldn't really get to the bottom of why she didn't like him. They didn't like him until after her death. So he rarely went to her flat. Now, when he left for the airport, he insisted that Claire went with him. And Claire was it was begrudging, and because it was 5:30 in the morning, and but she did, because she was, she was eager to please, she was that type of girl, and be there on his return. During that time, I quizzed her and said, tell me a little bit about him. And he was going through a divorce, and he was an ex-military man. I saw a photo, didn't like the look of him, to be honest. He was older than Claire. Didn't like the fact that he was divorced. And I mentioned he seems to have hard eyes, which apparently Natalia had said as well. On his return, he said his suitcase was very heavy, and he didn't want to trudge it across London, so could he stay at the flat? And Claire, knowing how the girls felt, was felt uncomfortable, but he did. He stayed over. Now, I didn't find out this until the next day. That morning, after he had stayed overnight, she wanted him to go. I didn't know the details, but she said, I wanted to be on my own, and I escorted him to the station. He refused to catch the train. He refused to catch the second one. I was really fed up, Mum, and I went home. He'd left his case in the apartment, and I plonked it outside the door and said, just go, Michael. I just want to be on my own. With that, he refused to leave. He was outside for 2 hours. Claire told him to go. The two girls, in no uncertain terms, told him to go, and he got quite abusive, and eventually he left. Claire was upset. She said, Mum, it's over. He wants to be with me all the time. I can't see my friends, even coming home. It's all happening too quickly. He's talking about us being together forever. He's talking about loving me, and this is making me feel really, really uncomfortable. That following day, she messaged him and said, look, no, Michael, it's not working out. And that's really when the stalking started. And being in a security guard, it was really, really easy. He would stand in front of her counter. He would watch her for hours on end, bombarded her with texts all day long, pleading with her, saying he was sorry, that there was issues at home with his mother. And Claire said followed her home with a big bouquet of flowers, which she left outside to demonstrate that she did mean what she said. And this sort of went on for about 3 weeks. It's like 3-week blocks. And wherever Claire was, he would follow her outside in her lunch hour. He would follow her home. And there was a pattern that was forming where Claire was messaging her. One thing I probably didn't mention was these two girls were not only her work mates, but there were also her flatmates as well. So she would message them. They would be on a different time duty, and she would message them and say, could you meet me back at the outside the station? She didn't want to be on her own with him at all. And she became ill. It took its toll. He was using work colleagues to try and convince Claire that he just wanted to be her friend. He just wanted to talk to her. And she did meet up with him and said, look, Michael, please, but I haven't changed my mind about seeing you in a different sense. But of course, as you all probably know, that would make things worse. After the girls were being affected by this now, because especially Susan, so she was on the counter, and he stared at her for 3 hours, and she said he looked so angry, and it was very clear that he was seeing them as an obstacle between turning Claire against him. He was absolutely convinced there was a relationship between them, and that would never be broken. They were meant to be together forever. Now, after about 3 weeks of declaring love and all of these things, the messages started to change. he was starting to get angry, and he was sending messages like, "If I can't have you, no one else will. I'll kill myself if we're not together." Really concerning for Claire, he sent a message, "It's our anniversary tomorrow. How shall we spend it? Is it because you're English that you're so cruel to me?" Uh, the girls were getting increasingly angry with Claire that she wasn't doing anything about it. She didn't want to get him into trouble. She didn't want him dismissed. Stalking, the word stalking was never used then. She just wanted his behaviour to stop. I felt pretty helpless. I was working 2 hours away and working on split shifts, but Claire would talk to me most days about this. She was getting eye infections. It was coming out. She wasn't sleeping at night. She was getting in trouble with work. The impact of what was happening was enormous. There was a couple of occasions that was really frightening. One, she was out walking outside Harvey Nichols to the tube station, and she saw him behind her, and she started to run, and he ran after her and shouted out, "You stupid little girl, you know you love me, I love you too." And she, as I said, she was a girl that didn't like attention. She was very shy, and it was awful for her. And then shortly after that, and I'm talking about 5 weeks, that's all it is. This is the last 2 weeks we're talking about of the stalking. She was on the tube. The girls weren't talking to her at this point because they were saying our lives are being affected now, and so you must report him. So she's on the tube. There he is again. She runs down the platform. He runs after her and Claire jumps on the train and he jumps after her. And she's crying at this point. And she says, "Michael, please leave me alone." And with that, he smiled. He was opposite her. He stroked her face and said, and she said, "Michael, if you don't leave me alone, I will have to report you." And with that, he said, "If you report me, Claire, I will kill you." And she was phoning me up. She was in a real state. And to be honest, neither of us knew what to do. Not in a million years did we think he would carry out his threat, but we thought that it would exacerbate the situation by reporting him. As it happened, it was taken out of our hands. And 4 days later, one of the girls did report him to head of security, who took it very, very seriously, put CCTV cameras on Claire, on him, sent him up to another counter, which he ignored. He was still seen outside Harvey Nichols. There was nothing really that they could do but suspend him. So the head of security said, "You're going to have to report him to the police, Claire. That's the only way we can get some kind of restraining order." So the police were involved. They escorted him out. He was dismissed from Harvey Nichols. He was escorted out of the store in front of Claire. And Claire phoned me up very upset. She said, "He looked so angry with me." So he was not only rejected, he was resentful as well because he lost his job. Unbeknownst to me, all of these things were high risk factors. So Claire reluctantly reported to the police. It appeared they took it very, very seriously. They took out a non-mole order, and he not to go anywhere near Claire. And within 24 hours, he broke that and he was seen outside her flat, waving up to Claire. Claire and Natalia were moving into a flat not far away, and was seen again. The police did nothing about the first. They drove around and he wasn't anywhere to be seen. But the second time, again, he was nowhere to be seen, and they asked Claire to get in the back of the police car, and they drove around and saw him in a doorway. He was arrested in front of Claire, and he smiled as the handcuffs and put the handcuffs to be put on. Claire was in a terrible state when she told me. This was over the phone, and neither one of us, Claire, really cared or wanted to know what had happened to him. The reality was the professionals, the police, were dealing with it. That was the last time Claire ever saw Pesh. Unbeknownst to us, he had been sent to Belmarsh for breaking bail conditions, and this was for 8 days. He went back to Slovakia and retrained in arms, and legally bought a gun and smuggled it through the country. The big black cloud around Claire was that she might have to see him in August when the case was due to be heard. But and there was confusion, and this we found out after her death, between the CSP and the police. So the CSP was saying section 4, and the police, or the other way around, section 4 and the CSP section 2. So it was all a bit grey. It was settled out of court. Claire was advised to drop the threats to kill, and he'd accepted harassment at this point. And she said to me, "Mum, I can finally put this whole awful episode to bed. There's no need for him to be angry with me. He'll get a small fine, community service." And words that will really ring in my ears for the rest of my life. Finally, people will believe me. And she really still felt the guilt that she had gotten dismissed, and also there were people, work colleagues, that thought she was a silly little girl and she made a fuss about nothing because there was no physical violence there. He'd only declared his love. Case was due to be heard, not the case to be. Sentencing was at the end of September, and it was 13th of September, and Claire was on a lake, and there was a witness. There were 4 witnesses. There was a young woman opposite Claire on the counter, and we spoke a year and a half after Claire's death, and she said she put her hand up to say the time, 10 minutes to go, and Claire gave her a beautiful smile. She saw a shadow behind Claire, thought it was a boyfriend meeting her from work. He raised a gun, Luger pistol, shot her in the back of the head, and then shot her several times in the face. And then with that, he turned the gun on himself. Needless to say, our world turned upside down and will never be the same again. And then I started researching about stalking. I met up with Carol Faruqi, whose daughter, a mother whose daughter had been stabbed 16 times by an ex-boyfriend who was a stalker, stalked her. And we set up Protection Against Stalking. And with others, we managed to get the helpline with Susie Lamplugh Trust, and with Network of Surviving Stalking at the time, we managed to get the helpline for stalking, which was one of our missions. And then in 2005, we managed to get the Section 2A and Section 4A, the 1997 Harassment Act, which changed everything. It was wonderful because Paz then got the, Campaigning Charity of the Year and Dodds Charity of the Year, but it was everyone, it was everybody that gave evidence, and so that was wonderful. And now Paz has a Kent stalking service, helping many, we've helped over 1,000 now stalking victims locally, and many nationally as well. But as I said, there's much work to be done, because since Claire, we all know how, Jane, 94%, isn't it, Jane, of approximately of domestic homicides, they're stalking via. So yeah, that's Claire's story, and tragic that it is, it's still happening. But thank you for listening to me, and I'm way over time, I'm sure. Actually, I'm not bad, am I? Am I, Ross?
You did very well. You did.
Oh,
Done well, Tricia.
time.
Perfect.
You've made it. That's
Story.
thank you so much, Tricia. That's just such a poignant story, and I know a long while has passed, but I'm sure it doesn't get any easier. You know,
It
having
doesn't.
to
I
tell
mean, I
that
tell
story.
Claire's story, Ross, but
Yeah,
she's a part of my life every single day, and this is why, you know,
yeah.
I do this, and also I work for a amazing charity called After, who help other victims of families after domestic homicide.
Yeah. Well, really appreciate you coming along and sharing.
Thank you.
Really, really helpful. Thanks, Tricia. So we're going to move on. We're going to keep the Q&A session to the end. So if people could store up their questions or put them on the group chat, that would be great. And we'll just keep going because we want to leave enough time for that reflection at the end. So we're going to move next to Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith, Professor of Public Protection at the University of Gloucestershire. So if I could welcome Jane to the floor, and she'll be able to tell you a bit more about her background and her work and share her own thoughts on this issue. Thanks,
Okay.
Jane.
I'm just going to try and share my screen and hope that the IT
Okay.
works. So
Yeah.
this is the right, no, this is the right one. Am I sharing?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yep.
See that? Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay. I will just spend just a minute talking about the approach that I take. So I am actually a homicide researcher, a homicide specialist, and because so many of the homicides when I first started as a researcher were linked to domestic abuse, coercive control, and stalking, it became a kind of a natural progression to focus on these intimate partner homicides. And so I suppose I moved into an area where I was a homicide researcher rather than a domestic abuse researcher. And those two things are actually quite different in a lot of ways. So I've been kind of arguing that domestic abuse is not given the status of other homicide, other homicides, other forms of violence, other forms of abuse. We do not take a forensic approach to domestic abuse, and that really actually quite shocked me, because we still look at domestic abuse as something that's less serious in a lot of ways, and something that we don't need to take as seriously. And it's only the very few cases that, these outliers, these anomalies that cause us problems. But, it's just simply not true. So I'm in the short amount of time that I've got to speak here, I would like to talk about taking a more forensic approach to stalking and domestic abuse and coercive control, because they are all so very closely interlinked, not just in that who the victims are and who is the perpetrator, but it's the motivations of the perpetrator. And when we start looking at the motivations to stalk, the motivations to control somebody are incredibly similar. And coercive control followed by stalking is a particular mindset. So I just wanted to briefly mention Russell Bishop. Now, you may not know, but Russell Bishop's girlfriend from 1986 was recently prosecuted for perjury. In 2021, she was prosecuted for perjury for something that happened in 1986. Now, Russell Bishop was found guilty of the murders of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway. Some of you will remember those Babes in the Wood murders, they called them. And his girlfriend at the time, Jennifer Johnson, had lied to the police about something which was actually fairly small, but turned out to be, you know, very central to the police case. Anyway, nobody really took her very seriously that she was being abused and stalked. So if I can just give you an example. When he was arrested for these murders and he was on trial, Jennifer attempted to run, to flee, to leave him. She was terrified of him. The police knew he was beating her. This was an awful, awful relationship. She didn't actually know that he had killed these little girls. His family and him got together and employed private detectives and journalists from, I think it was the News of the World, to track her down and drag her back. Now that has got to be one of the most awful examples of stalking in that context. Now, let's shoot on to so that's 1986. Let's shoot on to 2021, when all of this was raised in court, when Jennifer Johnson was accused of perjury. And it was treated with in exactly the same way in 2021 as it was in 1986. And Jennifer Johnson was found guilty, and the coercive control, the stalking, was basically pushed to one side. So I think the reason I want to mention that is because of that timeline, 1986, 2021. Have we really not come any further on in our understanding of how these things, one, impact the victims, and Tricia spoke brilliantly about the awful impact that this had not only on Claire but on her friends as well. You know, one person can have such a massive impact. And still in 2021, we still are not looking at those behaviours and saying that must have had an impact on that woman. She must have been scared to talk. This must be witness intimidation. So, you know, I wanted to mention that case because it is, you know, very recent, but from 1986. And I think if we took a more forensic approach, so we tend to look at these things, broadly speaking, as crimes of passion, and oh, they'll get over it, and you know, this is just about, you know, this is called unrequited love, isn't it? A brilliant title, because you know, most of the narratives that we, when we talk about stalking and we talk about coercive control, we're kind of leaning back on that unrequited love narrative, which is a romantic narrative, which is not really a very forensic approach. So there's no scientific research that supports this crime of passion. None whatsoever. We've got to start recognizing that there's research out there, there's science out there that tells us different things about the way the perpetrators think, about the way stalking plays out, and the behaviors and the patterns, and they are historically stable. They are the same in 1986 as they are in 2021. And Anne was saying earlier, you know, the behaviors are the same. The medium used, you know, we've got electronic mediums now, that changes. But the behaviors, that forensic kind of, if we use that for forensic interpretation of what's going on, that remains pretty stable. And that's what we should be doing in 2021. I will come back to that slide in a minute. So, and then this is another then and now slide, really. So I do have a picture here, Tricia, of beautiful Claire, looking so happy and so lovely. And I've put in a picture there of Alice Ruggles, of Holly Gazzard, and of Katie Wilding. I mean, I could have put 200-300 pictures in this timeline, couldn't I? I've picked out these young women because their cases are so similar. What happened to Claire in 2005 happened to Alice in 2016. And really speaking, you know the Ruggles family, Tricia, don't you? It is so similar. It's quite alarming. Not only that the behaviours were the same, but the police response was pretty much the same as well, wasn't it? With that 10-year gap. Yeah. So if we just have a look quickly at Claire, she had a very short relationship. So other people have long relationships, and in the research I've done, we've had Claire maybe at 3 weeks, and I've had another case 54 years. So the length of the relationship isn't really an indicator of the risk. It's what's going on in the perpetrator's head. So we need to be possessiveness, jealousy, separation, stalking, all of these things. The planning, and my research has found most cases have planning. There's other research that has found nearly 90% of cases have elements of planning. We have to stop thinking that these are spontaneous. They are not spontaneous, they are planned. We've got obsessive fixated, we've got, reports being made to the police, we've got arrests being made. And if we have a look at we've got exactly the same with Alice Ruggles in 2016, although Alice had a longer relationship. Every single other thing was exactly the same with Alice. Excuse me, I'm still getting my voice back. So I think it's, it's because these things are historically stable, the motivations, the behaviors, the patterns, everything is historically stable. We should be learning from that, and we should be moving past this crimes of passion. Arguments between two people that will probably blow over. I mean, you said, Tricia, for Claire, it was people weren't really taking it very seriously. But the same thing was said to Alice Ruggles when she complained. And she didn't even know herself, Alice, did she? When she called the police, she said, well, I don't know really if this is... And I think Claire was feeling the same. She didn't want to get him into trouble. She didn't want to, blow things out of proportion, as it were. We've got to get past this. We're not wasting police time. And this isn't victim precipitated. In the research that I have done, victim could be anyone. They have zero impact really on what happens, because this person will be like this in all their relationships. They will be controlling, they will be obsessive, they will be fixated. It's part of who they are. It's not part of them being so hopelessly in love with someone that it brings out these these behaviors. That is not what the research is telling us. So if we've got, at some level, we have to accept that there are people who are far, far more likely to kill than other people. We don't all go into relationships with the same potential for killing somebody. People who are controlling, obsessive, fixated, jealous, possessive, these people are far, far more likely. Sorry, someone was talking to me then. So we've got some common patterns here. I've nearly finished. So control, jealousy, possessiveness, failure to accept challenge, lacking empathy, ignoring instructions. We really got to start taking breaches seriously. We really, really do. Instead of just thinking that, texting someone and breaching an order isn't serious. It is. And this one, failure to accept the end of a relationship. You've probably all heard of the homicide timeline. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is a very forensic approach to tracking risk, motivation, and victim responses. And I just put that in because we have recently just completed some research, which isn't published yet, for the Home Office, where we have put temporal sequences into intimate partner abuse related suicide, honour killings and homicides, and stalking, entrapment comes up in every single case. So in every timeline in suicide, in honour killing, and in homicide, stalking patterns and stalking behaviours, and that fixation and obsession comes across really, really strong. And just the final slide there is some of the reasons why I think we should take a more forensic approach. And I hope that I've managed to stay to time there. Did I manage that? 20 minutes? And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks. That was perfect timing, Jane. Yeah.
Good.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Some really interesting insights there and troubling realities there that I'm sure people will pick up on in the discussion later on. So let's move swiftly on just now, though, to our third speaker, Dr. Rachel Wheatley, forensic psychologist in HMPPS, and just invite Rachel now to the virtual floor to share her insights.
Lovely, thank you, Ross. So it's down to me then to be the naughty one and go over time, yeah? Thanks. So hopefully you can all see the first slide there. So I shall be presenting some sort of key highlights from the research that I've done recently. And this really was covering what drives men convicted of stalking. So, there we go. Okay, it wasn't moving my side, but now I can see that it is. So the second slide that we're on, hopefully you can all see the same thing, is just to show you visually the overview of the different typologies. That is quite a good classification system to look at different typologies of stalker. And I wanted to just highlight this because they are very different as groups of cohorts of people that stalk. My research really focused on the majority of them would be considered the ex-partner stalkers, so they would be the rejected typology, for those of you that are familiar with this typology system. And at least one of them was an incompetent suitor. Before I undertook my research, I also did a systematic review, and this was really just to look at what was already out there. We found really sort of limited conclusions, but we noted that time and again people were relating their research to the finding of insecure attachment style. Not a great surprise. Personality disorder, also not a great surprise because of sort of, you know, some underlying maladaptive relationship scripts. Personality disorder was really linked to not otherwise specified, which at the time then in the DSM was a more described as a more mild form of personality disorder, and actually had well over 50 different variations. So it didn't really tell you a lot other than that person has problems in relationships with people generally. The systematic review challenged assumptions about people that stalked having a higher intelligence level, which was always based on the fact that they were quite cunning and manipulative, and therefore people presumed they had higher intelligence levels. Not the case. Equally, the systematic review challenged the literature available around people that stalked having a high prevalence of serious mental illness. Again, this was found to be not the case. Basically, that relates to the setting that the study was undertaken in. So in forensic psychiatric settings, for example, you would find people that have committed stalking offences to have some kind of serious mental illness generally. But then when you put that out into the literature and put it all together, it looks like that must mean that all stalkers then have some kind of serious mental illness. So that isn't the case. And again, there are lots of unknowns around neurodiversity. So things, autistic spectrum disorder conditions, and the like. So there are lots of unknowns, but actually we know that that can be contextual and not causal to stalking. So really nothing massively conclusive. So again, we come back to this, you know, be typology specific, evidence-based and case formulation led in terms of approaches to understanding stalking. So that kind of underpinned the start of my research, which was to look at, well, what's driving them then, and how can we as forensic psychologists and other professions really address and attend to the needs. So there weren't any published qualitative studies at the time. And we knew from the reviews that most would not have serious mental illness, particularly not those in a custodial setting. So they must know and have an understanding of why they were doing what they were doing. And I also took the position that the person stalking they are the experiential expert. They know what their experience was. But my challenge was, how do I access that, knowing that people that I'd worked with and that had committed stalking were very defensive, didn't want to talk about it other than to blame the victim and say they weren't a stalker, so they weren't going to talk to me. So at the bottom, there's a reference to the research paper for people that do want to read a bit more in depth. But it was basically, I was interviewing people to get to their experience of what was driving their stalking. And I used a very task-based technique to do that in interview with people. So it wasn't just asking, why were you doing that? It was more about comparing different people in their lives at the time and how they viewed other people and what was going on. So that was a very brief overview of the position that I took to eventually get to look at what drove them. So again, the paper really describes that in detail. It's quite a complex technique. It's easy when you know how to do it, a bit like driving a car and when you're first learning. So yeah, that's just a brief overview. The people that I interviewed were men in custody, all in their mid-30s. They were sentenced to either a few weeks to a few years. The majority were very confidently, I would say, in the rejected typology, so ex-partners. One was very confidently, in my view, in the incompetent suitor typology group. All of them had used a mixture of online and offline stalking, and none of them had had any previous contact with psychology services or offender management units at the time that I had interviewed them. And the big reveal was that underlying stalking was this thing called narcissistic vulnerability. So again, the process of this research is that I interpret how they have interpreted their own experience. So there's the limitations to this, is that this was my interpretation of what they were telling me. So narcissistic vulnerability, I'm going to sort of cover in a second, but what the research showed through this process of analysis and interpretation was that the participants themselves had this real need for validation from their own contact with the victim or victims. And they needed that contact and that validation to feel good enough about themselves and to avoid a sense of inner pain. Again, I'm going to go over that in a second. Also, no deterrent. It didn't matter what happened, who was involved, what sanctions were applied, there was no deterrent because of this hierarchical goal of needing to feel okay again. And they all rejected the fact that they were a stalker. So really what they were doing was rejecting the label, which makes sense that because they were a very shame-prone bunch of people, very sensitive to criticism. So what I found then through the narratives was a lot of psychosocial vulnerability and this real need for a supply of validation from the target. And those were the things that suggested to me this concept of narcissistic vulnerability. They needed to feel like there was something to that person, whether they'd had a relationship with that person or not. So one of the participants was somebody that actually wanted a relationship with somebody but never actually had one with that person. But they needed to feel that they were still connected some way, they were still being validated. One of the participants actually said the reason stalkers do it is because of their poor social skills, their inadequacies, their insecurities, hence the psychosocial vulnerabilities. And it's being expressed in an unhealthy way because of their social incompetence. So I thought that was quite a neat quote, really, and quite insightful for one. So I had a look at vulnerable narcissism, and At the bottom there, vulnerable narcissists, they would generally act in quite arrogant and grandiose ways to really compensate and mask what's going on underneath. So underneath, they would generally have quite an unstable sense of self and self-esteem, hence why they're quite sensitive to criticism, because they're already quite vulnerable and fragile underneath. And they'll have lots of anxiety about relationships and how well liked they are. So just on the right hand side there, what causes narcissism? Oh, go back. What causes narcissism and narcissistic vulnerability is thought to be related to a perceived gap between how you perceive your ideal self to be. So they might be standards set by your family systems, the culture, parents, and actually what you believe your real self to be like. And that causes a real fragility in somebody's inner psychology, if you like. And some people have said that might be related to developmental trauma. And what that kind of means is in childhood related to attachments with parents. Was there any sort of emotional deprivation? Were they neglected? This doesn't necessarily mean abuse, but it might be how they've interpreted some kind of emotional neglect, for example. And how might it show is that any perceived threatening situation to the real or the ideal self would lead to anxiety. If you leave me or you don't want me, what does that mean about me? So what is it they interpret about that situation? And the interpretation is extremely strong and it's extremely negative, because obviously it hooks into that already fragile sense of self. So it's really about an exposure of this gap between real and ideal self. And stalking, therefore, could be conceived as a form of experiential avoidance. You're avoiding that finality and the reality that you weren't good enough for that person, or that person didn't want you anymore, or there was something wrong with you, or what does that mean now when people find out we're not in a relationship together anymore? What are they going to assume about me? Again, somebody in the research quite helpfully was talking through some of these concepts by himself and came to the conclusion, well, actually, it's a bit weird, isn't it? Because what I was actually doing then through my stalking is punishing her for me not being good enough for her. And again, I thought that was pretty spot on. So I started to have a think about some of this, and this is where, when I've talked before, and particularly when Jane and I have looked at each other's pieces of work, there's some connections here in how we're sort of conceiving some of this stuff. So actually, for the narcissistically vulnerable, others become really incorporated into their sense of self straight away, and they become relied upon to preserve it, and they have this real sense of connectedness. Now, that is interpreted from their point of view as they need that connection for that validation. And that's almost as simply as it is, probably not the level of connectedness that we might like in our healthy relationships. But when that other person's admiration is lost, the damage, therefore, to that already fragile sense of self is really quite overwhelming. And that will evoke all of the sense of shame and the connotations, therefore, of not being good enough. And the two together are actually quite intolerable for the person that is quite vulnerable in a narcissistic sense. So stalking then becomes that attempt to restore that sense of self, to gain validation, and to guard against any shame that they may feel. And then what that turns into oftentimes is the blaming of the other person. It can't possibly be them, that they weren't good enough. It comes out and as a projection to blame somebody else and exacting revenge. So what you'll see on the right hand side then is fundamentally this narcissistic vulnerability, or whatever you want to call it. It's just a sort of shorthand psychological term, really, for all the things I've just described. And what you'll find around it is that as a defensive strategy, people can be quite preoccupied in the relationship before its end, because they don't want it to end. You know, they might be quite possessive, very jealous. They are trying every which way they can to protect being left and not validated. And therefore, what you'll see is the defensive response once that relationship ends, which is the stalking, which has that higher relational goal, really, of making that person themselves feel good enough again, and trying to really avoid the eventuality of dealing with what all that means and the hurt and the pain that causes for the person stalking. So in essence, for anybody that likes IPA research, qualitative research, these were the superordinate themes, they were the subordinate themes. But what I've done is picked out some quotes that I thought were quite useful to try and pull out some of the things about what people were saying. So in terms of driving stalking, one of the aspects was about this chasing validation. Someone with low self-esteem is going to hang on to someone. When I'm with a girl, when they go funny with me or they're off with me for some reason, I crave attention, not for people to feel sorry for me, but to know that someone's interested in me. It's not as if I wanted to hurt her as such. I want to be a positive force in her life, but she'll not allow it. I've been a negative impact instead, which for me is better than being absolutely nothing at all to her. She's not out there getting on with it without a thought for me. I put myself in her path and she is now validating me. She's acknowledging me. What that actually relates to is police giving the victim information about the person's car registration, for example, and him being told that. In other words, they'll know that it's you because they've got details about your car, and he actually found that validating. It was all consuming. At the time, it was all consuming for that person. They couldn't just let it go. They couldn't just let the relationship go, because then they would be left to deal with all of the psychological pain that we've all been through. There's something in them that they couldn't do that. They couldn't process that. They did everything they could to avoid having to face that within themselves. So they were saying it's so hard to get out of that bubble, and all of the anger and the feelings, it's just there and you're locked in and you can't escape it. There was a whole maelstrom of upsetting negative thoughts, depression and self-loathing. Using a boat analogy, I've become in love with the boat and I want to save the boat, whereas there's probably other boats there a lot better, but I'm trying to save my boat. So again, that issue there of that connectedness. You're not living life to the full if you're stalking. You're that obsessed. You're so fixated to an unhealthy extent on this person. You're missing out on life. You're totally focused and you're behaving in self-defeating ways. So then what oftentimes people were talking about is that, you know, as the stalking continued, and you know, think they weren't obviously feeling any better about what they were doing. They weren't getting the person back into a relationship. The psychological pain of being left was still there, often turned to anger, because that's a very good way of deflecting any feelings of shame and hurt. So you'd see a lot of violent fantasies starting to come out in their narratives. I wanted to hurt her because I felt like a fool. I felt mugged off. I couldn't bear the thought of her out there living her life on separate paths and me having absolutely no part and no importance in that. So if I were to act on those thoughts, then I've played a part in her life. I've authored the end of her life. So I've made myself of some significance in her life story. I could see that I was in the wrong. There's part of me that's saying, hang on a minute, I'm going through all this pain over her and she can just swat me away, like swatting away an annoying fly. So you can see already there the level of distortion that people are feeling and experiencing in reaction to being rejected from a relationship. Again, something that's a very ordinary experience for people. They were saying that there was no deterrence. They were saying they all came to this conclusion as well through the process of the technique that I was using, where they have to describe a person stalking and what their traits might be, what their goals might be, everything else. All of them would look down at the task we were doing and reflect and say, wow, actually, when you put all that together, everybody could do without a stalker. They were very, very blinkered. And so they would say, nothing would deter me. So overwhelming was the need for her. I was so dedicated to it. In response to a restraining order, I didn't realize how serious a thing it was, to be honest. I didn't think I'd come to prison for breaking it. One person said, yeah, I remember when I was sat in the back of a police car, and I didn't really care, look back and think, in a police car, son, what are you doing? Feels like I was a different person totally, because I just want to go back and just shake him. Like, what are you doing? Obviously, I regret what I've done. Part of me is glad I've come to prison, because it's really given me a wake-up call and really been a slap in the face. So again, it just shows you that when they were in the stalking episode, it was just so self-perpetuating. A few people talked about having tried to access professional support before any police involvement. So they said, I tried to go to counselling. This person got referred to community psychiatric services, who basically would close the case because there was no evidence of any mental illness causing the problems. One person said, actually, what I'd say to people is you've really got to get it out there, because if it's left up in your head, you can't make sense of it. It's an absolute nightmare. Talking about it and hearing yourself speak, turning those thoughts into words, rationalizes it, get it all out there, talk to people and receive their feedback. So again, this idea of prison being a wake-up call for people. They didn't see anything else as its deterrent, but they saw prison being a bit of a wake-up call. And you know, people would refer to that as being like cold water had been thrown over their face, a bit of a slap around the face, and saying actually prison was the exact thing that I needed just to get out of that cycle of stalking. Interestingly, the pushback around stalking for the people that I saw wasn't about the behaviours, the 2 or more unwanted contacts that cause psychological harm to others, and that it's quite fixated and obsessive and repeated. The real issue was about the label stalker and the word stalker. And actually it made sense, because what they would say to me is, when they were describing a stalker, well, a stalker in my head is someone who'd wait for someone, know your routine, they followed you. A stalker is evil, sick, twisted, something wrong in their head. He's not the full picnic. It's someone who's predating someone. It's controlling an environment. So of course, nobody's really going to admit to, you know, oh yeah, I can quite happily say, yeah, I'm a stalker. That's fine. So what they would naturally do is distance themselves from that. And in certain narratives, it would look like they were massively minimizing and denying it. So what we were doing as part of these tasks is looking at, okay, look at the characteristics and the values and your feelings at the time you were stalking as old me or me past or whatever we labeled it. And then let's look at the characteristics of how you would describe or think that what's driving a stalker. And when they reflected back at the end, the majority of people were saying things like, wow, I'm putting myself past and stalker in the same boxes, in the same places. And I'm in denial about being a stalker. So, it felt really uncomfortable for them to see those comparisons. It's that word stalker. I hate it. I know that's what I'm labeled as now, but I don't think that's what I did class as a stalker. And somebody else was talking about the fact that they'd never followed them home. So therefore it was just messages, and therefore it wasn't really stalking. So through the whole of the exercise, what actually came out was that people would start to talk about a shift in how they were seeing themselves and what was driving them, not just what they thought drove stalkers. They could see actually what they were talking about is what they'd been doing and what had driven them. And they were saying things like, I don't want to label myself as a stalker, but actually I don't also like the fact that I've got the same traits as one. And that was a massive shift that I'd never seen in a forensic psychology interview with people when I'm assessing people for stalking risks, in that in such a short space of time, they could make those connections. So overall, what the conclusions were about the research in totality, really, and how practitioners can respond, were these things listed here. So sanctions alone aren't going to really work for the majority, because it doesn't fulfill the needs and what's really driving it. It's almost like they don't care. They're on self-destruct. It's very self-punishing. The issues here that came out from the research were around needing to consider different interventions and how they're using their time, so different occupations, and working with whatever typology they are and whatever their responsivity needs are. So that would include social things, practical things, as well as psychological interventions to really look at those maladaptive scripts, the narcissistic vulnerability, trying to draw on what we already know works. Everybody in my sample talked about experiencing depression, and everybody talked about at least going to see their GP. So I then think maybe we perhaps need to do a bit more work with our GPs, obviously to help support victims and spot stalking when victims come along describing symptoms, and maybe asking about situations, but also trying to spot that in potential perpetrators. I found that obviously the more sensitively you can engage non-judgmental, reducing shame, actually they can come to their own conclusions about what was driving it, and also be quite open about, you know, how possessive and jealous and how they were quite weak inside and they couldn't cope with what was going on and they wish they'd have got help for that. So that really helped in terms of just getting to the crux of what's going on, so we can help people to stop their campaign or work with them to address those needs, so they don't feel that they're as vulnerable to doing the same thing in the future. And that relates to the third wave approaches that I've talked about there, giving that level of validation even in the assessment scenario. Education around stereotypes and the law. So it came out a lot that there was some real negative stereotypes and a misunderstanding of the law and the legislation. I'm thinking about the use of custody on those two final points, really. It's thinking about what is the purpose of that for stalking? Is it lengthy enough for us to do anything meaningful in a psychological sense? Equally, short sentences, they can be quite disrupting for people. So they might lose their employment and lose their accommodation. And if there's not been enough time for any meaningful intervention, it kind of fuels those feelings as well. So there's some real dilemmas there that need to be really thought about. And a sort of an end-to-end approach as well, and a multi-agency approach. Limitations of this study, like I mentioned at the beginning, were it was mostly rejected typology stalkers, and also they were in custody and seemingly out of the episode, so they did have that distance from that cycle they were in. And that, thank you very much for listening, is the end of my presentation with some contact details and some information if you did want to read the details of the study itself. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thanks, Rachel. Hugely interesting, isn't it? And I think it's great to try and get that balance between, you know, what drives that behaviour, what motivates stalkers to stalk. And it's certainly our experience within our support service for victims that sanctions don't always stop a stalker. And so even as a service, sometimes we can feel quite helpless in how we can support victims, because there is no guarantee about what stops a stalker. But it's been fascinating to hear from those that have stalked in prison what their thoughts are, their reflections, and how they perceive themselves as well. And maybe that's something we need to learn more about, because it's all about victims just now. Maybe we need to try and understand. And understanding stalkers, we need to listen. Stalking, maybe we do need to listen more to stalkers and understand what drives them more. So absolutely fabulous. Now, so we're going to move on. Ross has had to leave because he's got another meeting today, and we're going to, move on to our final speaker, which is Hamish Brown. Hamish retired from the Metropolitan Police in 2004 as a detective inspector, and he worked with New Scotland Yard Specialist Crime Directorate. So that's been a long time ago, but Hamish was around at the time when, during Claire's, when Claire was being stalked in the murder. And I know, Hamish, you have spoken out with Tricia on numerous occasions about Claire's murder. But you have done a lot of work within the stalking field. You received your MBE for the work you've done with raising awareness about this crime. You're also a consultant, you're a trainer and a lecturer on the stalking legislation, celebrity stalking, workplace violence. In fact, my understanding is that you're on television a lot. They call on you an awful lot as an external consultant. But you wrote a book you were commissioned by the Home Office to write a book on, what was it? It was an investigator's guide to stalking and other forms of harassment. And that was a long time ago when we're looking at where we are now. So that information was out there for police, an investigator's guide. That was actually commissioned by the Home Office. And it was interesting what Jane was saying, what Rachel's been saying, and what Trisha's been saying. You know, the police and the Criminal Justice Service have had a lot of information about stalking. And here we are still pushing all the time. I'd ask everyone to mute, just to, that's fine. That's fine. So I want to just ask you one or two questions about this. Why is it taking so long? What is, you know, I had a meeting with police yesterday, and they're still saying, yes, stalking's falling through the net, and more needs to be done, more needs to be done. And when we look at the amount of work that is being done, the amount of media reports and stalking all the time, you know, what is going wrong? What else needs to be done, Hamish?
Yes, thank you very much for the rather lovely introduction. And yeah, I feel very humbled following the speakers before. Trisha, of course, difficult act to follow, whoever you are, and the academics. My goodness, I'm not an academic. I haven't got an academic qualification to my name. I'm a retired police officer. I'm an investigator. I give advice on stalking, and I do agency work within the criminal justice system. So to keep the investigative side going, but from a completely different angle. So that is my tack. And you quite rightly mentioned about things still going wrong. And when I lecture, and it is to, and this was prior and hopefully post-COVID, to quite diverse audiences. Yes, great big crime conferences around the world, as well as the Rotary clubs and the WIs and people like that, sometimes police officers and lawyers. The thrust is raising the awareness, and I present this simply by anecdotal examples and case histories to drive the point home. Now, I remember two particular presentations I gave. One was at a domestic violence conference. It was multi-agency in central London. And I was just showing the audience about it, beggars belief what stalkers can get up to, and you've got to think outside the box. And I gave some general advice that if you know a couple who have split up and say the man has left the flat, left the house, change all the locks, and if nothing else, get his keys back, because it's not unusual for the perpetrator to come back, the stalker, and rearrange the furniture, change the chess pieces round the other way, move the fridge magnets round. It's just that feeling of unease. Someone's been in your flat, albeit there's no specific crime there. It's not a break-in, it's not a burglary. So I was pushing that home, and I gave an example of a lady who's in the habit of writing post-it notes to herself, and just to remind us to do things. She'd split up with her boyfriend, hadn't got the keys back, but on a post-it note, just before going out, she wrote on the note, buy some bread, and just put it on the kitchen table. She went down the road for a couple of hours to go and have a coffee with a girlfriend. And when she came back, there on the kitchen table was a loaf of bread. That sometimes gets some audiences going for that, just to think about it. But I later spoke about police attitude and raising the awareness with them. And I came back to this scenario, and I said to the audience, you will remember the loaf of bread situation I described. And I said, the police officer recording that complaint looked up at her, gave her a little smile, and said, oh, I wish I had someone to do my shopping for me. And I remember a number of the audience throwing their head in their hands. And I think these were those from the domestic violence units. And yes, they couldn't believe what I was saying, because they'd probably seen it in different ways at their police station. And it is a matter of getting that message out. And with that, the other presentation I want to mention, I think it was Victim Sport in South London somewhere. I'd better not say which one. And it's the first time, and the only time it's happened, the audience turned against me, and it was very, very scary. I was just going through raising the awareness and the police. In fact, I hadn't even got on to the police attitude. and the audience, the hands were going up, they were shouting, and everyone in that room, good people from victim support, had a different story about how badly victims have been treated by the police. I'm not a police officer. I do support the police a lot, actually, because I've been there. I've been in no-win situations. But in fact, the chair had to calm them down and told them to sit down. We had to calm everything down for a few minutes before I could return to that. And that is the feeling. And I know where it's coming from. So it doesn't matter, well, it does matter, but if it's the police or members of the public, teachers or the boss at work or someone like that, to understand that the acts in isolation, often in stalking cases, will not be crimes in themselves, but it is the totality or the circumstances of the behaviour. If I stood outside someone's house all day or continually followed them around, individually that wouldn't have been a crime, but the totality of it would have been very worrying and very upsetting for the victims. And that is what has got to be put across, and it's got to be kept on, hammered home. And from the excellent presentation, particularly from Trish, because I know she does this, it's really got to push it. It goes much deeper into the academic side, and I thoroughly enjoy listening to that, and I can't compete with that, but I certainly can compete with cracking on with that message and just understanding it's going to beg a belief what stalkers can get up to. And there's no point sitting there with your mouth open, just amazed what victims are saying. You have to take this at face value, because that is what stalkers will do. And indeed, when we look further into this, we touched on a little bit of cyber stalking. Some people say, well, should we have a separate crime of cyber stalking? No, it's stalking, whether it's by electronic means, IT, or the case that you set me on my way was a man leaving anonymous notes on someone's car, 64 actually, sent through the post or left on that car, signed the bad guy or Mr. Stalker. 17 going on 18 was the young victim. An absolutely terrifying experience. So it doesn't matter, from my view, whether it's electronic means or indeed whether it's actually physical. The fact is that is the crime. And a case in point, I sometimes rhetorically say to audiences, is it a crime to tell someone their shoelaces undone? I said, of course it isn't. It's a stupid question. It never will be a crime. Well, a case in point, man and woman fall out, badly fall out, they split up. There is a young child, John, he's 5 years old. The lady is walking down the road, holding the little boy's hand. There is no one about in the street. Her phone bleeps, her mobile bleeps, cyber, it's a text message. She reads it and it simply reads, John's shoelaces undone. And she looked down and it was. But of course, people will agree it's not a crime to tell someone their shoelaces undone. But that poor woman was at 10,000 feet and rising, just by using an act which in itself is not a crime. So it doesn't matter if it's IT, cyber stalking, or the actual physical act. It could be terrifying and it's controlling. And I think with that, I enjoy speaking to college students and sixth formers. I don't speak to those younger than that. And I make no apologies for going in quite hard about it, but because they're sometimes treated as a bit of a joke, this, which of course it is not. But I do mention one point, and I point out to them that I'm not there to be their dad. I'm there to give a talk on raising awareness of stalking, but the control, and part of that is revenge porn. And I think we must just remember this, and I say it's up to you. You know, your age, what pictures you allowed to be taken of yourselves. That's up to you, and I'm not going to comment on that. But just remember, when that lens goes click, you have lost all control of that image. And yes, there is a crime of revenge porn, but that doesn't matter a jot by the time it's gone round your college, round your, I don't know, round your workplace, or even worse, to your mum and dad. So I bring that back, and I just say, you know, well, what about adults themselves? Yes, they can get involved in revenge porn. Do they need that sort of advice? And again, it's the IT side, absolutely fantastic. I'm not terribly good at this. I managed to get it switched on today, but that's about as far as I can go. And it is a wonderful facility, but there's a bad side to it as well. And we've all got to be careful what information that we put out there. And I sometimes sort of joke with the audience, you know, like, well, summer holidays are back on the agenda, and hopefully stay that way. And I say to them, you know, when the summer comes along and you're going on holiday, will you be putting a sign outside your house saying, I'm away for 2 weeks? And the audience chuckle. So I said, well, why is it people do that on social networking sites? Put a picture of their house, I've gone to Corfu for 2 weeks. I mean, it's utter ridiculous madness. Even worse, I'm still in the south of France and I'll be here for another week. I mean, the answer is you put on the internet when you come back where you have been. So the internet crime is very, very important. But really just to sum this up, I've spoken about the police and there have been improvements and there has been some very good work. But consistently, when I deal with victims, they're referred to me. I had one a couple of weeks ago and she'd fallen out some, it was over a leaking pipe, someone above her. I know through others, he's not a very nice man. And what he was doing was putting sharp nails in her parking place. And the police come along and have dismissed it as antisocial behaviour. They are wrong. And my advice was you write to the chief constable and ask for an explanation. You take it up, you push it forward. And they've taken an easy way out, partly because they do not understand. But really the last thing I want to mention is that the victims themselves can be a little bit prickly as well. And you have to learn to deal with those. Just to emphasize, the acts of stalking very often will not be crimes in themselves. It is the totality that counts. So we have a victim, and I remember one lady being referred to me, and we were just chatting away, and she started off with a classic and said, it's nothing. Is it now? Well, you've reported it to someone, you're worried about it, so why is it nothing? So please think about this question I ask. Has anything changed in your life since all this began? Not what has changed, because that's leading. Has anything changed in your life since all this began? And this lady went, yeah, well, it's nothing really, but I don't go down to the gym on a Wednesday. And oh yeah, I don't see my mates in the pub on the Friday. Oh, Saturday, I don't go shopping with the girlfriends. And then she slammed her hand down on the table, frankly, actually, and she shouted, look what he's done to my life. But 60 seconds earlier, she's saying it's nothing. So it's a very pertinent, it's a very powerful question. Has anything changed? Another thing I come across is they're blaming themselves. It's all my fault. It's all my fault, I should have gone out with him. My fault, I met him on a dating site. No, the only person at fault is the stalker, not them. And the victims are there to be supported. And this is where I certainly come in and just tell them what the law says. The act in isolation will not be a crime probably, but put it all together. How do you feel about it? I feel upset. Right, well, that's the crime and we're going to move on from that. The last thing I hear is people say, I'm going mad. No, you're not. That's what the stalkers will rely on. Little acts to tune people up, to move the fridge magnets around, move the furniture around the flat. Lady has 3 flower pots to her right when she comes out the house of the flat and 1 to the left. When she comes home, there are 2 on each side. I must be going mad. I didn't remember moving it. No, you're not going mad. This is what they rely on. I mentioned earlier the seizing of the house keys. Well, what about a shared car and people split up, get the car keys back as well? Came across a case where The man and woman had split up. The car was an issue. The lady had the car, and the man knew the area she worked in. He walked round the streets, found the car, and moved it afoot. And she gets in the car, the lock's at a slightly different angle, the wheel lock. I must be going mad. I must have imagined that. No, you are not going mad. So really, to summarize, and for the last time, the message must be put across clearly, very simply. I acknowledge and very interested in the academic side, and I can't compete with that. But my thrust is raising the awareness, because if you don't recognize it in the first place, you're not going to do anything about the crime, which would include an intervention with the perpetrator, which might be an arrest or giving good advice to the victim. The act in isolation, highly likely not to be a crime in itself. It is the totality or the circumstances that count, the whole picture.
Yeah, thanks, Hamish. Very interesting, because there's the most common understanding that the stalking is a precursor to rape, physical assault, violence, and possibly murder, which we've just heard about today.